Hello, everybody. A very, very warm welcome to you. Thank you for attending this Social Research Association webinar today. Our topic today is using archives in social research. I think as researchers, we're constantly generating new knowledge, new findings, collecting new data, but what about the data that already exists? So we're really looking at how can looking backwards shed some new light on the present, perhaps the future, and help us with our social research. So I'm really looking forward to finding out. My name's Georgina. I'll be your host for today's webinar. I'm really thrilled to introduce four fantastic speakers. We're going to be starting off with Angela Whitecross of the University of Manchester, followed by Phyllis Macfarlane of the Archive of Market and Social Research. Next, we've got Christina Magder of the UK Data Service, and then Annie Irvine of the King's College London. So fascinating lineup of experts, and I really hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. So as our speakers are presenting, do feel free to start writing questions into the Q&A feature. If we have time after each speaker, then we're going to take just one or two questions that directly relate to that presentation before moving on. But then when all four speakers have finished, we're going to host a Q&A panel for all of the speakers. So please just get your questions in as we go along and in that final Q&A session. We do ask that your questions have no personal identifiers in, just because we are recording this event, and this event will be available in the coming days online on the SRA YouTube channel. So without further ado, we can get stuck right in. And I'd like to pass over to Angela Whitecross at the University of Manchester. Thank you, Angela. I'll just give you control. There we go.
Lovely. Thank you very much for inviting us to speak at this event. So I'm going to be talking today about NHS Voices of COVID-19, which is a project based at the University of Manchester. Hang on, let me find my mouse so I can. Sorry, it did this a second ago. There we go. NHS Voices of COVID-19 is a UK-wide research programme, and it's funded through the HRC and through the UKRI COVID-19 urgency call. So at the moment, our source of our funding, our project is developing a national collection of personal testimonies around COVID-19, which will be preserved at the British Library as a permanent public resource for informing policy and practice. The collection is in progress of being transferred at the moment and is available to the public. Crucially though, one thing that I'm going to talk about is how this programme of work builds on our existing NHS at 70 project. So how kind of doing research kind of enabled us to adapt and pivot during the COVID crisis. So just going back a little bit in time to how the project initially started. So the first iteration is NHS at 70, the story of our lives. So our project director, Professor Stephanie Snow, applied for funding to the National Lottery Heritage Fund in around 2016-17, focusing on collecting personal testimony around the history of the NHS, as Stephanie had worked extensively on the history of the NHS, but found that actually it was like within the existing archives, there was actually the voices of everyday people. So those people who use the NHS, who work in the NHS as the third biggest employer, and everyone in between, everyone in the UK has an experience of the NHS. And these kind of more personal, I suppose, reflections of that kind of relationship with the NHS were largely missing from the broader narrative, both in academic stuff, but also within the archives themselves. So using the 70th anniversary in 2018 as a focal point, our first project worked across 10 localities in the UK to record and document the history of the NHS through the voices of people. We used a participatory research model. So across the 10 localities, we recruited volunteers, trained volunteers. Those volunteers would go and record the stories. We use oral history as a methodology. So it's a kind of life history approach, using personal testimony. So it's semi-structured and kind of training and recruiting volunteers to do it, and broadened our reach. And we interviewed around 1,000 people on the NHS at 70 part of this project. And alongside this, because it was National Lottery Heritage funded, there was a huge public engagement programme. So part of our recruitment strategy, I suppose, for enabling people to share the stories was to do arts interventions, community workshops, attend events, all kinds of in community situations across the 10 localities we worked in the UK. So our overarching collection at the moment is over 1,800, I think that's nearly more like 2,000 now, recorded oral history interviews. We've got around 1,300 interviewees that have participated, and these have taken over a period of time from 2017 to 2022. Some of our interviewees have contributed an interview during COVID and also prior to COVID, giving the collection a kind of a longitudinal aspect of somewhere to kind of look at the relationship people have with the NHS at different points across time. Throughout COVID as well, we've interviewed around 100 of these people on a regular basis. So that's people contributing a regular series. Some of them range up to around 30 interviews over a 2-year period and include that kind of pivotal pre-pandemic interview and then a longer final interview. Our project funding is coming to a close now, so we have completed a lot of these final interviews as we transfer the collection over to the British Library. What I wanted just to kind of talk about is, I suppose, thinking about how you use archives in social research, but how we archive socially. So actually using a participatory research model to create an archive, to create information that isn't already there. So by working with volunteers and stakeholders, we have broadened the reach and the diversity of the resultant collection. So the 1,300 interviewees that are now deposited at the British Library, without using a more social participatory research model, we wouldn't have been able to reach that many people as academics just working our own or anything like that. And actually embedding volunteers and acknowledging that volunteers have a central role and that they contribute invaluable skills, experience and knowledge. So a lot of our volunteers come from the NHS, or retired NHS staff, as well as, you know, all iterations within kind of life, as in kind of a volunteer model. And what that has done is, typically heritage, I suppose, oral history projects traditionally might include people who are interested in the history of a building or heritage generally, whereas actually the NHS, being such a broad reaching kind of all-encompassing organisation, has really kind of demonstrated, I suppose, the strength of working with volunteers as the core kind of principle of the project. That extends to the people who are interviewed, who also, I suppose, micro-volunteers in giving their time to do an interview, to share their testimony. And, you know, the different reasons that people do that is either leaving a legacy, or to inform policy, or to make sense of their own experiences. So basically, prior to the pandemic, we were nicely working in 10 localities, and we were just about to embark on a lovely exhibition tour. Well, we were actually already on tour with an exhibition highlighting some of our oral histories that we'd collected, looking at kind of different moments of care in the NHS. And then obviously we've got the COVID-19 pandemic. So as a project team, we quickly decided pivoted towards actually documenting COVID. So because we were already set up to record NHS experiences, we just submitted for an ethics amendment to enable us to record over the telephone, because essentially we are still recording NHS experiences, but COVID being that kind of, you know, it was like a pivotal moment in the history of the NHS. and it was almost like, how could we not capture it? So just to kind of give you a brief idea of what timeline we were working on, you know, we've got this kind of advising against all essential contact. Our university campus closed. We went and rescued all our equipment very quickly. You know, you've got this stay-at-home message from the Prime Minister, reducing all social contact. And already by the 25th of March, we'd conducted our first COVID-specific interview. So we'd not only had to adapt ethics, we had to adapt the way that we interviewed. We used to interview in person. We had to change that to over the telephone and still be able to record in WAV, so it was archival quality. And then by the 1st of May, we'd submitted our application in partnership with the British Library to the UKRI. I suppose as a team of staff, volunteers and stakeholders, we felt like, how could we not document COVID-19? The main benefit of having this kind of human capital resource of volunteers and stakeholders was meant that we consulted with them immediately. Would you like to do a COVID interview? Would you like to conduct COVID interviews? And the response was overwhelmingly positive, that yes, we must be able to, we must capture this period in which we're living. The legacy of the project is the kind of the positioning of these pre-COVID recordings alongside the COVID recordings. So the NHS is part of our everyday life. Adding COVID-19 interviews kind of enables a broader interrogation of our collection, attitudes to NHS in distinct time periods before, during and after COVID. Our collection is situated actually within the British Library's wider COVID-19 collecting initiative. So there's going to be like a portal on their website, gateway to all the other kind of COVID collecting that they've been doing, such as the web archive, other projects. I can't think off the top of my head, sorry. And part of the kind of, I suppose, response that we've had is that it's instant. So we recorded in the moment. So we're not actually going back now, so to speak. Well, we are recording now, but we're recording now, knowing that we're recording now, but actually some of the material that we collected in, say, March to June 2020, I don't think you could ever get the rawness of that data. And the fact that it is situated within a broader life history and develops over time with the kind of longitudinal and series-based interviews, makes it, again, an incredibly social archive. I'm just going to give you a little indication of what's in our archive. If you could play the film now, that would be great.
I definitely experienced a lot of loneliness. It was not being able to see my friends, not being able to see my partner. Yeah, it was such a hard year, really hard year.
The afternoons are spent sitting in the office, basically ringing families to tell them, I'm really sorry, your loved one is really doing very poorly and I'm very concerned they're going to die. And some days you'll have that conversation 3, 4, 5 times.
You see people who look healthy, who haven't got that much of a history of concomitant conditions, who are younger than yourself and who are dying. It's quite horrific.
I was on pretty heavy drugs. The delirium got progressively more unpleasant. Shrunken heads around the ward. I could see a samurai assassin. It was, just deeply terrifying.
We look after my mother-in-law. She's in a home now. The staff has not been getting their PPE. And I written letters to local MP. And I told them if any one of them falls ill, they will spread it to the home and they'll all die.
A whole range of emotions through the pandemic. A lot of fear because obviously having been ill, my immune system was compromised. Also recognising that we're a family of colour, so if we get it, we're 4 times more likely to die of it.
We've really, in the NHS, come to massively value each other in a way that's created a lot of kindness between staff that clearly wasn't there in quite the same way beforehand.
So that was just a kind of a brief, that is actually a trailer for a longer short film that we've just created, and that is using some of the original testimony from around March 2020 with participants listening and looking back on some of that testimony there. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just going to talk very briefly about the kind of use of the archives and what we've been doing. I just like your computer never work when you want it to work. I don't think the mouse is letting me do anything.
No, I just really hope that.
How is it?
Can I ask, why did you
agree
to take part in this project?
It just plays that, sorry. So yeah, just thinking about some of the policy impact that we've been able to have. I
just really hope that,
so that
the record is utilised.
Things, and I don't know why. So this is just a list of some of the policy stuff that we've been able to do, and actually have that kind of rapid response analysis of some of the oral history testimony. So actually using oral history in a way to inform policy and process. And also one of the other kind of things that we've been doing in terms of research is working within charities and NHS trusts and actually disseminating findings back with stakeholders that we're working with to enable them to actually use the archive in a way that's meaningful. Anyway, that's me done. Sorry about me limited IT skills. I've just come back from holiday, so I'm a bit all over still. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was really, really interesting. I wonder, are there any questions coming up? So I will leave that for now, but I did just have a question about sort of the storage of the archive, just in terms of if anyone else finds this interesting or they want to access the archive. Is this open to the public? Is it open to researchers to access the data?
It is, yeah. I'll stick the link in chat to the catalogue in the British Library.
Fantastic, brilliant. Okay, if you have any questions for Angela, let's see. So there is a question, can people still share their story?
Yeah, we've got about a month left of recording, so people are still contributing at this point, but we are going to have to draw a line under it at some point, unfortunately, until we get extra funding.
Yeah, that makes sense. Fantastic. Okay, any more questions regarding this presentation, keep popping them in the Q&A and we will get to them at the panel at the end. Okay, so our next presenter, I'd love to welcome Phyllis Macfarlane from the Archive of Market and Social Research. Let me just,
How
there
is
we
it
go. Phyllis, you should be able to control the screen now. Take it away.
We're all nervous. I forgot to unmute myself. So sorry, everyone. How do you follow Angela with all of that? That was the most brilliant response to a crisis. It's always marvelous to see what people achieved during the pandemic. So I am here to talk to you about the AMSR, the Archive of Market and Social Research. I too am having mouse problems. Georgina, do you want to do it? Might be easier. There. So you're going to do it, Georgina? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to explain the history of the archive and what it contains, give you some ideas about how it can help you with your work, tell you about our plans going forward, and perhaps suggest that you think of donating your work to the archive. to preserve it for the benefit of future researchers. Georgina. We said earlier on, if Georgina lost mouse control, we were all in trouble. But we're so far managing. So just to say the history, it was established in 2016, basically by some of us who were getting rather longer in the tooth and thought that a lot of the history of market research was being lost and our heritage was being lost. That we've concentrated basically over the last 5 years on preserving mainly the paper documents, so mainly stuff from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and we've been digitizing them all. It's a very good decision made by some of the earlier volunteers, and you can see the website there, and it's available freely to everybody. It's run entirely by volunteers working through a selection of committees. Working with volunteers isn't always easy, as Angela probably knows. And I run the contents committee, and basically I collect, digitize and curate, but probably more interestingly, I'm also developing the usage of the archive, which I find very interesting indeed. Georgina? So just to go what context we have, obviously we have what has survived through the last 70 years, but we've got a lot. It's rather an eclectic collection, 7,000 items, and it's lots of conference papers, newsletters, history of market research and methodology, a lot of social research, including Mori and NOP opinion polls. We've got a real gem in the CRAM or Peter Cooper collection of commercial qualitative research. We've got academic research in the Ehrenberg and Goodhart collection. We've got a lot of BBC audience research. And believe you me, it does keep coming in. You'd think it would be running out, but it does keep coming in. We can go to the next slide. What I want to tell you a little bit is about what you can do. How can our content help you? And you're social researchers, so I probably don't have to explain this as much as I would have to commercial market research. It's mainly for context. It's also there for research methods and approaches, case studies, especially qualitative is useful. We've done lots of reviews of subjects that you can use, so you don't have to spend too much time, metaphorically speaking, up to your elbows in dusty boxes. It is all digitized. And for example, we did something on pets for a famous modern British historian, and she's about to publish, well, next year, nothing happens quickly in the world of archives, a history of pets. And we helped her with that. And she was very grateful for many things, but the best thing I thought was that we had a study that showed that people talk to their goldfish, and they use that to prove that really goldfish are pets, because she had a co-author who wanted to not count goldfish as pets. Anyway, and also, as I said, academic papers on segmentation, which are interesting if you want to do that. So just looking at some work that actually, we changed the slide quite quickly to the next two, Georgina, looking at some work that, no, you've gone too far. No, sorry, I didn't realize that the next one was a build. Carry on. You carry on clicking through. So it's easy to forget how much we've changed. So if you look at some Mori data, which Bobby Duffy of King's College prepared for us just recently, you can see how homosexual relationships between consenting adults were considered morally wrong, in how many people consider them morally wrong in 2019, and how that has reduced in 2019, sorry, 1989 and 2019. The interesting thing, of course, is that women were always right about this subject, but men have managed to improve in their values over time. So the next one looks at how much things have stayed the same. So if you ask people whether they think it's morally wrong to have a sexual relationship with someone who is married to someone else, you can see that actually attitudes haven't changed very much, which slightly surprising. You thought that they would have might. And again, you see that that men are now more aligned with women in their views on this subject, which again I thought was quite amusing. And the next one shows that how things have changed on some very big issues. So capital punishment, fortunately, as only 22% thought it was morally wrong in 1989. 37% think it's morally wrong now. Leave you to judge that. But euthanasia, never 22% thought it was morally wrong in 1989 and 17% now. Not shifting, but moving in the right direction, if you agree with that. But sometimes, we'll move to the next chart, we'll see that some things we think are getting worse, and they are. So if you look at 1989, 36% agreed that politicians were good people. In 2019, only 15% think that politicians are good people. So there you are. So that's just through a little trot through some quantitative data. Another interesting thing is that you can use it for if you're actually working with questionnaires and looking at actual research. I was looking at a recent survey question, has Britain become less racist over the last 26 years? And 46% said yes, it had. If you go back nearly 20 years and look at some Murray data, a similar-ish question. I do wish, if you're a young researcher, that it is useful to ask the same question if you want to replicate things. But anyway, that confirmed a similar trend. But the question, which was exactly the same in the two surveys, we asked ethnic minorities, have you been a victim of racial discrimination? In 2022, 39% said yes. In 2017, 58% said yes. Now, that is kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? And presumably, you have to think about this, that is because our definitions of what racial discrimination is and our awareness of what racial discrimination is has changed a great deal in those times. And perhaps, anyone doing a survey on this going forward should think about asking additional questions so that we can understand those differences. I think it's very important to research. But coming on to sort of one of my favorite subjects in the next chart, I'm looking at how society has changed. I'm a mathematician by training, but I clearly should have been a historian. I've clearly missed my métier here. But people asked us, well, what can we learn from data on inflation in the 1970s? And I was looking through all our qualitative data, and I thought, oh, this is so difficult. The 70s was so different from now. Everybody's attitudes were different. Attitudes to husbands were different. How can we compare it? But then I started noticing the concept of going without that we read a lot about in the newspaper, and that hasn't changed. So listen to these quotes. If I buy 5 chops, I give 2 to my husband, give the 3 kids 1 each, and I buy myself a hamburger. They're only 5 pence each. Imagine hamburgers being only 5 pence. Or my little girl goes tap dancing. She could go 3 times a week, but she goes once. She says, why can't I go 3 times? I can't afford to send her. It's 4 bob a time. The third one is about going to the hairdresser every week and not being able to afford it, but nobody wants to do that these days. But also this aspect of treats. A lady said, I still have chocolate digestives with my coffee. I hide them, which I thought was rather sweet. So that was an interesting comment. If we look at the next slide on how society hasn't changed in many ways, you'll find similar quotes to that. But the other thing I noticed was in this 1974, the frustration of these housewives was growing, the resentment. They said, we don't resent the work we do, but we would like more appreciation. Everything is taken for granted. So these women were sitting there with a housekeeping budget, and their husbands were expecting a meal on the table. The children were expecting a meal on the table. These were the days when you ate set meals. And there she was fighting 25% inflation in the shops. I mean, it's unbelievable. And there's a survey here, with an NAP survey, but interviewers with readers of the Woman's Own. 1 in 3 of the poorest wives on £10 a week or less had not seen an increase in a housekeeping allowance. 2 wives in 5 find it difficult to keep up with price rises. I mean, really, you know, there's a lot to learn from this. And my thesis from this, and I'm looking for somebody to take this on, if anybody's interested, because I think it's worth a dissertation or a PhD at least, that after this, the non-working housewife role started to disappear because women were fed up with no financial independence, the restraints of housework and the demands of husbands and kids, and they started going out to work and getting their own thing. I know there were other drivers, but I think inflation was a big thing. So that's one of the ways in which we're trying to promote the use of the archive. So Georgina, if I talk now about what we're doing, well, we're continuing to collect as much heritage material. Obviously, we have to do that, otherwise it will get lost. And we're growing contemporary and specialist collections by stimulating the flow of more modern research. And like Angela, we've got a COVID collection. We're collecting all the research done in the COVID, which was a great deal, diversity, Brexit. So we're making the archive more sustainable and ongoing, but also, as I said, my favorite topic is to generate greater usage by historians, marketers, other academics and school children. And if we look at what we're doing there, the historians are no trouble at all. I mean, to them, an archive is like water is to a duck. They love archives. They just love searching around with things. If you look at marketing and communications academics, they want much more curation of what we have. They really want it on a plate, as it were. Secondary education students, so we've been helping modern British history A-level students with their dissertations. They address subjects like discuss the downfall of Mrs. Thatcher in 1990. We've got a lot of stuff on that, but they need it curated. They've got limited time. And also for the market and social research industry, as I said at the beginning, you probably get it, but a lot of commercial market researchers don't understand that their day-to-day market research is very interesting, will be interesting in the future. So there we're demonstrating how to add context to their reports, because it's something they often don't think about. So next, Georgina. Basically, this is a call to action. You're all supposed to end with a call to action. Really, if you've got reports that you want to put in the archive, please do contact me. You'll be surprised how quickly things get lost after 4 or 5 years. They're your legacy. And the best thing about them is they're at the time. Nobody goes back and edits them. And most history, remember, is edited by somebody or another before it actually gets somewhere. These are the genuine voice of the people at the time. So it helps them, historians and social historians in the future, to understand our times. And of course, it demonstrates the value of research to society. So I'm sure you're all sitting on the edge of your seats wondering about the next slide and what you should be sending me. So content that we'd particularly like is work that you're particularly proud of, especially qualitative work. I think the work that Angela's doing is absolutely fabulous. That is so important, that qualitative work. Any research that links to action taken, so any research you did that led to social change or innovation, and especially on strategies which changed views, and especially when all short now of examples from social media. And the thing is, so I'm probably preaching to the converters, all the research that we do tells us about the state of society at the time, and it all has future value, and we do need to preserve it. So if, as they sometimes say on the BBC, if you have been, thank you for listening, and please please do contact me with any queries you have. I love knowing what people are using it for, or would like to use it for, or would like to donate it. I find it absolutely fascinating. So there's my email. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Phyllis. That's been extremely interesting and really great to see some of those changes over time. That was totally fascinating, and there's so much in the archive. I've had a bit of a dig about myself.
Well, it helps you understand your mother and grandmother, perhaps.
It's fascinating to see the differences as well as the things that stay the same and the things that actually are fairly consistent over society. Brilliant. Any questions on Phyllis's presentation? Please keep putting them in the Q&A, and we will continue to go through our presentations and have that panel discussion at the end. So I'd now really like to welcome Christina. So I will share the mouse with you, Christina, but you're welcome to just let me do it for you. Just let me know. But yeah, I'd love to pass over to Christina Magder from the UK Data Service.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. Today, I'll just briefly discuss how we at UK Data Service enable social science research with the collections that we have, with our collection development policy, and also the 3-tier access and license framework. Oh, it did work. I am very, I'm sorry about that, Georgina. So a little bit about UK Data Service. We are funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, ESRC, and we host the largest collection of UK and international social, economic, and population data. We don't only provide users with access to the data, we actually provide support throughout data usage, but also data deposit with guidance and also regular training and bespoke training that we do. I am based at the UK Data Archive, is the lead partner of UK Data Service, and UK Data Archive has been around for quite some time. It was funded back in 1967, and we are a center of excellence in acquiring, curating, and providing access to the largest collection of social science and population data. We are very keen on making sure that data that is made available via UK Data Service follows the FAIR principle of publishing data. Those are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The main aim of these 4 principles is to enable better research and to make data very discoverable so other researchers can make use of it, and also enables reproducibility. A couple of stats about UKDS, just to put some things into perspective. We have around 8,500 datasets in the collection, with roughly 250 new datasets and new editions added per year. Currently, we have around 45,000 registered users, and we're going to see we have users from all the research community, and they account for around 130,000 downloads per year. Who are the users? We have academic researchers, students, undergrad, postgrads, government analysts, researchers from charities and foundations, business consultants and data analysts, and also independent research center and think tanks. And of course, independent researchers as well. It might be just someone that wants to learn more about using data. We do have a variety of data sources coming from national statistical authorities like the Office for National Statistics, governmental department, intergovernmental organization, research institutes, and also from individual researchers. And we're going to see how we've created 2 separate repositories enabled to better manage the curation and handling the data. In regards to the data portfolio, it's very diverse from UK surveys. We host a variety of large-scale government-funded surveys to longitudinal data, and most of the major UK surveys following individuals over time are hosted via UK Data Service. We have a variety of multinational aggregate data banks and survey data. We host the census data from 71 to 2011, and we've just started making available available some aggregate data from the 2021 census. So if you're interested into that, it started being published. The microdata will be coming in 2023. We have a variety of business microdata, which we'll be discussing very briefly about how we make more disclosive data available by our secure environment. And we do have a range of multimedia qualitative data as well. So a couple of case studies, how are actually researchers using data at UK Data Service? We can see this researcher here has used the quarterly labor force survey and the family resource survey for a wide variety of years from 2016 to 2020. Both surveys are nationally representative, so a lot of findings can be done when doing research with such surveys. So for example, they found out that 21% of workers in the UK experience work insecurities. They have seen how unevenly spread among the regions in the UK this is. For example, males and females experience similar levels of insecurity, and 26% of disabled workers are in insecure work compared to only 20% for those without a disability. I've added a lot of links, so if you're interested in any particular case study, please do follow up on the links in the slides, or you can always get in touch as well. Another interesting case study is actually assessing progress in protecting non-smokers from secondhand smoke, and it was done using the Scottish Health Survey from 1998 to 2016. We do have the most recent data as well now. In this case study, these researchers that have conducted the analysis, they discovered there has been an increase in percentage of non-smoking adults who have no detectable cotinine, I am not quite sure how that is pronounced, in their saliva, from 12.5 in 1998 to 81.6 in 2016. So this study is actually reinforcing that by adding a smoke-free policy, it actually helps protect all non-smokers from people that smoke. And the final case study that I chose to present today is about creative clusters in the UK. The researchers used the business structure database, the annual population survey, and the annual business survey, so a lot of business data, to look whether there are creative clusters in the UK and how the government can help them. They did draw the conclusion that it needs to recognize the important and growing role of creating conurbations in the UK's creative industry, and to put in place suitable strategies to help them develop further. So as I was saying, we can see there's a variety of data. How do we actually get data in the collection? We have a collections development policy, and we actually have an appraisal process for all potential new data offers that we receive. So our data appraisal group, which is made of people from the collections development team, from the curation team, and from the user support team, they make an assessment on the data offer that we receive in accordance to our selection and appraisal criteria. And one of the following decisions is taken: either to accept the data in the curated repository. The curated repository, all the data that comes in, it's actually curated by our ingest team, our curation team. So they do a lot of value added enhancement on the data. For example, with quantitative data, they would be adding all the value labels, variable labels, if missing, of course. They would enhance the documentation. We can also accept the data in the self-deposit repository reshare. And that's not to say that's data that we don't look at. No, all the data that we receive, it's actually reviewed in terms of disclosure checks, in terms of copyright breaches. Any ethical and legal aspects would be reviewed when we receive the data. However, the data in the self-deposit repository reshare must be curated by the researcher, must be presented in a preservation format, and then we make it available. Very rarely it does happen that we receive an offer that is not quite suitable for our designated user community. And that might be, for example, some recordings from webinars. We've actually had an example quite recently. So we usually advise them to use either an institutional repository or a more generalistic place of deposit as well. A couple of examples in regards to data and to make a bit of the difference between the curated and the reshare repository. So with the curated repository, we host all the large-scale governmental surveys, the one that were used in the case studies that I picked, such as the crime survey for England and Wales, the annual population survey, etc. We do have a lot of information online about key data owners and data collections that we make available. So if you are into or you have students that want to do secondary analysis, please do ask them to check our pages with the data collection. The reshare self-deposit was actually initially funded to host only ESRC funded datasets, smaller scale datasets. However, over time, it had actually grown quite a lot, and it now hosts everything that is within our remit. So as long as it is social science, we can accept the data in, and we're very, very proud to have researchers, even from outside the UK, researchers receiving funding from different council bodies actually depositing data with reshare. The license framework is actually the one that enables us to ensure that we make data available at a feasible access level. So I have seen in the chat there were some questions around the consent. How is the voices from NHS data being shared? So we take all of that into consideration, and we also take into account the level of disclosivity in the data, and we can have a discussion with the data owner in how best to make the data available. We do have three options: either open data, safeguarded data, and control data. When we talk about open data, we are discussing data that has no real disclosure risk. And it's usually under open licenses. We have all the Creative Commons licenses available, the Open Government license with the Open Parliament license, and there are almost no restrictions on reuse. And I'm saying almost no restrictions on reuse, not very often, I would say. Sometimes you might have the non-commercial restriction on reuse. Most of the data we host, however, it is safeguarded data, and it has a zero to low real disclosure risk. So because of all the different variables or the information, if we talk about qualitative data that are available in the collection, there is a very minimal disclosure risk in the data. So this type of data requires authentication. Everyone can register for an account with UKDS Service. Very, very straightforward, but everyone that registers an account with UKDS Service must agree to our end user license agreement, meaning that they actually read our microdata handling guide, they make sure that they use the data ethically and legally, and they get in touch if they discover any issues at all. The highest level of access is control data, and this is where the real disclosure risk in the data lies. We're talking here mainly about business microdata. So we've seen the example with our annual business survey that is hosted in the controlled environment, because the variables are very granular. And again, the control data currently is only available for quantitative data rather than for qualitative data sources as well. To access data into the controlled lab, it actually requires, and I can move on to the next slide, it actually requires the entire 5 safes framework. We can see here, I've made 2 slides for this just to show how the license framework mimics the access framework. Is exactly the same. We offer the 3 options to the data owner: open, safeguarded, and controlled access, and then the researchers get the same 3 tier levels of access to download data. So the 5 safes framework, again, it's used for data that is disclosive, very sensitive data. So we do need to put in place additional safeguards. All the data is de-identified, so we wouldn't be finding names or addresses in. However, is the level of granularity. Everyone that wishes to access data in the controlled lab, they must have their project approved by the data owner, and for data from the Office of National Statistics made available via the Digital Economy Act, they must be approved by the Research Accreditation Panel. All these projects must demonstrate public good. Having said that, I don't want this to sound as a if you find the control data set you really want to make use in your study, always get in touch and ask our opinion. We are here to help rather than just, oh, you send the applications. Any questions, do get in touch. When I present the 5 states framework, I always do a couple of warnings. I don't want to scare people off using control data because it does come very handy. You would also need to complete the Safe Researcher training and gain an accreditation researcher status. Very straightforward, and all the data is used within the secure lab environment. So you can't just take it out, you can't write anything from the screen, everything is used into the secure environment. Finally, to ensure that there is no disclosure risk, we have added the final step, safe output. So any data that you want to take out of the secure lab is actually checked for secondary disclosure. Our user support team is doing that, and if any queries or concerns arise, they will be in touch with you for any changes that might be needed. And I think that would be it. I've tried to keep it short. I know there was a lot of information, but any questions are very welcome. Either if you want to use data from our collection or deposit your own data, we are here to help.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was so interesting. It's really interesting to see a quantitative, mostly perspective, and also understand what data is out there, and that what those different words mean, what those different processes and steps mean, and that it might not be as scary as people think when it comes up with a controlled data set. So thank you so much. That's been great. Any questions regarding Christina's presentation, again, pop them in the Q&A. We will get round to those. Now I'd like to introduce our final speaker then. I'll share control with you, Annie. I'm very pleased to welcome Annie Irvine from King's College London. Take it away, Annie.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. So yeah, I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. I don't manage or curate an archive. I'm just embarking on the first steps of using one. So that's what I'm going to reflect on in the next 10-15 minutes. So quick outline, I'll just give a bit of an intro to who I am, and also what is the Timescapes archive, which is the one that I'm hoping to make use of. I'll talk about why I applied to use it, so the kind of reasons why I'm embarking on this secondary analysis. I'll give a really brief intro, literally just the headlines of what is QSA, if people aren't familiar, and then really reflect on the learning curve so far of sort of setting foot in this area of qualitative research methodology and the sort of methodological and ethical tensions that I'm coming up against. So yeah, so I'm Annie. I'm a qualitative researcher currently employed at the ESRC Centre for Society and Mental Health, which is based at King's College London. I'm up in York, hence my interest and affiliation to the Northern SRA branch. So the centre it's focused on exploring changes, how changes in contemporary society and rapid social change are affecting people's mental health. And we've got three streams of research, but I'm on this purple one, the work and welfare reform strand. So our areas of focus are on precarious employment, conditional welfare benefits, and how those two things affect people's mental health. But as I've got into this role, I've got increasingly interested in how we conceptualize mental health and what we actually mean when we use this phrase mental health, because it's being used increasingly to cover a wider range of experiences. So this is just some context to sort of why I'm delving into this archive, to think about how people talk about mental health and mental distress, and how that might influence their interactions with welfare benefit systems and employment experiences. So to hop back to what is the Timescapes archive, and I've noticed we're really lucky actually, so I'm a user of the archive, not a manager, but I think in the attendees today we've got Karen and Karen who do actually manage the archive, so possibly in the Q&A if you've got questions of a similar nature, so you might have for the other speakers, that they may be able to be called upon. But the Timescapes archive, it's an archive of qualitative longitudinal research studies, academic studies, I suppose, which is currently held by and managed by the University of Leeds. And it originated as an ESRC project, so it brought together 7 qualitative longitudinal studies that were all broadly focused around biographical narrative experiences, change over time in social relationships, families, and wider social networks. They were brought together under the ESRC Timescapes project, and they were both sort of substantive and methodological projects done on the back of that to explore the possibilities and scope for doing this kind of research. So the Timescapes website has a wealth of really helpful and valuable resource, both about what are archives, what is qualitative longitudinal research, methodological guidance, as well as the outputs of the project itself and the substantive studies. So it's really worth an explore around if you're interested in this. The application process to the archive, I found it extremely straightforward and very well supported. So Karen and Karen really quick to respond, really helpful and very encouraging of using the material. There are, similar to what Christina just described, different tiers of access. So for the sensitive data sets, you also do need to get in touch with the original studies PI for their explicit consent as well. But again, I won't spend a lot of time talking about that. It's very similar to what Christina's talked about, but very straightforward, and the emphasis being on supporting you to do this as long as you've got good reason to access it. The archive itself has a slightly different URL, but you can browse that without having actually registered in terms of getting a sense of what's in there. So all the different projects are listed, including the numbers of interview transcripts or the overarching demographics of the set. So when you get these slides, you can have a look at sort of the different data sets that are in there, and it's growing. So it's not just the original 7 projects, there's more and more being added, including quite contemporary data sets, which is my reason for going into this. So why did I apply then? So for a little more context, so I started this role at the centre in September 2020. So as you'll know, and going back to Angela's presentation, this was fairly early on in the pandemic. So I was new to post, but I was working remotely. It was a new research centre. And so I was starting to think about sort of what my role in developing this programme of work around precarious work, benefits and mental health. But it was a really difficult time to launch a new project. And that's, you know, clearly many people did manage to do really essential research during this time, but I was new to post, new to the institution, working remotely. So on this topic in particular, I didn't feel I could really get going on any empirical work. So whilst these ideas were generating around, you know, concepts of mental health and how that relates to people's experiences of work and welfare, I just happened to realize or to notice that the welfare conditionality project had been added to the Timescapes archive. Now this, without spending a lot of time on the detail, is a qualitative longitudinal project that ran from 2014 to 17, which really focused on people benefit claimants' experiences of sanctions and conditionality in the welfare system. It's not a project I was involved with, but I knew the PI through previous work and some of the co-Is, and I've been really following it with interest because it overlapped with a lot of my areas of research interest. And what was really exciting was that I knew that from the sort of almost 500 participants in this study, over 200 of them had talked about experience of mental distress. And I thought, so maybe what I can do whilst in this stage of not really being able to get going on designing a new project is to access the archive, have an explore and do some scoping to see, you know, if the kind of questions I'm wanting to look at arose in this project, how do people talk about? So what could I initially learn in a sort of scoping sense from this data that's already there? So to quote from Tarrant 2017, which is a brilliant paper on secondary analysis, my original intent, I guess, was to sort of use this to support and potentially enhance the development of my conceptual framework for the study that I had in mind when circumstances began to allow. But once I'd accessed the archive, I very quickly realised how much data was in there and how rich it was. And as I started to look into the methodology of QSA, realising that these can be projects in themselves, not just preliminary prep work. So what's happened and the stage I'm at now is this grew into a full research proposal, having also become aware of the ESRC's secondary data analysis initiative. So actually what I've done is written up a full-blown proposal to the ESRC to do, as this second quote describes, to prioritise a concept or issue that was present in the original data but wasn't their analytical focus. So the welfare conditionality project looked at, you know, people's direct views on welfare benefits, sanctions and conditionality. But I want to sort of go in at a different angle, focusing on those participants who talked about mental distress as part of the reason underlying their benefit claims, and look at the language they use, the way they describe their experience, and then to see if that influences their benefit experiences. So really briefly, what is QSA? Jumping around a bit again, it's reusing archived qualitative data, and I don't think I really need to go into that with heard about this already this afternoon. But to finish up by talking a bit about sort of my learning curve so far, being doing this for the first time, I think 3 things have really stood out to me. One is that you do need a new research question when going in. So it's different from sort of quantitative secondary analysis in that respect. It's not a replication or a validation exercise of what the original team did. And I think, again, thinking back to the what Christina said, you need to have a rationale and a justification for why you want to access this data and what value is going to be added with your project. Familiarity with the data set, or often described as orientation, is also really important to the original study. So understanding the participants, the aims of the original project, what methods they use to generate the data, and the wider context of historical and geographical. And in timescapes, a lot of that is there really helpfully in the archive. There'll be sort of metadata that describes where the interviews were done and when, and that kind of thing. And then the third thing, which I initially found quite daunting, was that the methodological literature advises communication with the primary research team. And that gave me real pause, because I was sort of apprehensive that I'd just be seen as a nuisance. You know, this team's done their project, archived the data, and then here I come knocking on their inbox asking questions about it. And I did find that kind of quite a daunting prospect, but it hasn't been like that at all. The PI, when I applied to access the data, got back to me really quickly and was really supportive. Other members of the research team that are still around and about have been really supportive, chatting with me and giving more context, and have basically been really enthusiastic about what I'm proposing, in terms of them recognising that there is a lot of unexploited or underexploited data in the archive that they would like to see being used as well. So it's been very much welcomed from what I can tell. So to finish up, and I do apologise for the clutteredness of this slide, but I just wanted to get it all in one place for you. The learning curve, some sort of key points I've been on so far. One has been definitely, as I developed it for the ESRC bid, that obviously makes you have to think harder about the methods. So I've been reading into the background sort of arguments for and against doing qualitative secondary analysis. And I think there's kind of one major camp, or on the against camp, has been sort of historically resistance to secondary analysis of qualitative material because of the implications of a lack of primary involvement. So going back to the kind of the fundamental qualitative paradigms as being very much about embedded and embodied research, very much based on relationships. So some writers, as this has started to become more not common, you know, as QSA has developed, people have said, well, can you really do this if you weren't there, and the importance of being there, and sort of how can people really understand the data and interpret it and make sense of it if they weren't there in those real embodied relationships with the setting and the participants. That's been countered more recently. So the argument being that all qualitative research is interpretive. So although the primary researchers do obviously have a special relationship with the data and with the participants, that doesn't give a monopoly on interpretation, and any analysis is an interpretation. So there's nothing to say other researchers couldn't bring that to the data set. And also more recently, and I think this might be quite relevant maybe for people in applied research settings, certainly from my background, there are disciplinary differences. So I think these arguments against, because of the lack of understanding of settings and not being there, really come from sort of anthropology, ethnography, when yes, it's part of your data collection, it's the fact that you were on the field sort of thing. But actually this recent review by Mazurski et al. Saying actually they looked at 100 studies from applied health research, and it's actually very rare that there's a long-term relationship with the participants. They actually sort of pride themselves on the independence, and they weren't known to the researchers prior or after. And also doing team-based research, often we haven't done all the interviews in a study if we're working in larger research organisations. So some of these arguments about the relational nature don't really hold up in the kind of research that many of us might be doing now, if actually you're frequently working with transcripts that you didn't do the interviews anyway. The major kind of argument for is this sort of maximising the use of data, particularly when it's funded by taxpayers' money, minimising the burden on participants if it's an area where there's been a lot of research done and you can't really justify asking similar questions again if the data already exists, and also a positive of being able to teach with real data for learners. And I think the sort of implicit sense that we are now in favour of this, UKRI is endorsing it. It's indeed, it's archiving is expected. You have to make the case to not archive your data. And with the funding streams like the Secondary Data Analysis Initiative supporting secondary analysis, it's kind of the message is there that at least the funding world would like us to be doing this. But just again, on the flip side, there's this recent paper, or not so recent, but saying just to be mindful that we don't lose sight of these important ethical and methodological arguments in the push to make the best use of data and to squeeze every inch out of it. We do need to think about going back to our sort of original qualitative paradigm. Methodologically then, the kind of big learning point for me is that the uncertainties involved in doing a secondary analysis of an archive. So obviously the need to orient yourself around, find out what's in there and spend some time checking out the feasibility of this project, because you don't know exactly what's going to be in there. You don't know if there will be enough to support the kind of project you want to do, and a lot of time can be required just to establish that before you even start on the project. And I was thinking about the first project, the NHS Voices archive, so with nearly 2,000 interviews. I was just thinking of a researcher who decides to use that. Where do you begin in trying to seek out, you know, it might be about text searching, but yeah, methods to figure out if what you're interested in looking at is in there. And then finding focus. So the Tarrant paper, again, she calls it getting out of the swamp. And I really found that as I started doing some sort of feasibility pilots, everything to me was so interesting in these interviews. And I realized I was trying to do a sort of full reanalysis, which isn't the idea. So there was quite a long process for me in writing the bit of honing down what my new research question was and setting the parameters and being disciplined and sticking to that. I think with archive data, the quality of transcripts is something to consider. So there isn't, in timescapes, to my knowledge, none of them have the audio. The transcripts that I'm using for Wellcommed are very good, but you don't have access to check any inaudibles, or if anything comes across as probably a typo, you can't verify that and sort of clarify anything. And again, you can't probe or seek collaboration or clarification on anything. So if somebody sort of dangles a really fascinating thing about their mental health experiences that I would have probed had it been my primary project, you can't do that. So essentially the data is what it is. And that's I guess a limitation or a consideration. So yeah, just to quote, you know, it could be a risky course to follow in terms of the outcomes of being quite uncertain, but the time commitments can still be expensive, just realizing that. Lastly then, sort of ethical tensions. And I think some of these for me arose particularly because it's a contemporary archive. So the welfare conditionality study was 2014 to 17. So many of the researchers are still active in this field. And obviously you would hopefully the majority of the participants are still living as well. So in general, you need to get explicit consent to archive. And I've actually popped a question in the chat. I'd be interested to know how other projects are dealing with this, particularly when they're sort of not such academic data sets that have this very well-established consent procedure. So anything in Timescapes has got that level of consent from participants from the original projects. But I was slightly I thought because it was like a static data set and I wasn't doing any primary data collection, I wouldn't need to go through very high level ethics, and that turned out to be wrong. So because of the what's called the motivated intruder test, where if somebody was motivated to try and rebuild somebody's identity from archive data, even though the transcripts are pseudonymized, I've had to go through full ethics to show how I'll ensure that people can't be identified from what I do with that. So things like if I do any sort of case examples, they'll have to have details changed or not reported as full case studies, just to make sure that people can't be reconstructed. And then lastly, the issues around living research teams. So as I said, they've been massively supportive and encouraging of this project, but I felt some sort of unease around the issues of ownership and labour, and this has been recognised in the literature. So there's over 1,000 interviews in this archive, and I've literally, you know, a half day's work of filling in a form, and then the push of a button, these all arrive in my hard drive. And those years and years of labour went into this. So that didn't sit completely easily with me, and I've had to reconcile that. But also that some members of the primary team are still using the data themselves. One of them is writing a book on the gender dimensions of the data set. So there could be sort of tensions around the sort of competition of concurrent analysis and for sort of academic researchers, publication, and you know, who's getting the benefit from this data. And I think that bears thinking about. And just lastly, sort of maintaining parameters on my own research questions. So again, to emphasise, you know, the massive support and positivity of being in touch with the primary research team, but obviously they're also very invested in the project and have their own original research questions. So as we've been discussing what I want to do, they've been saying, oh, you could look at this, you could look at this, and sort of being, you know, tactful and grateful and respectful of that, whilst also thinking, actually, that isn't what I want to do, and just sort of navigating that. to make sure that, you know, sort of take on board and appreciate their input, but also keep some clarity around what the parameters of this new project are. So just to end with another quote, just that this contemporary archives sort of concurrent primary and secondary analysis magnifies some of these issues, particularly the ethical boundaries between researchers, participants and secondary users. So all of the references I've got in the slides are there, so you should get these and be able to click through. And yeah, just thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was so fascinating. Can I just ask a quick question about, you mentioned about engaging with the primary research team. Yeah, what sort of involvement is expected, you know, because you mentioned about the tensions of using secondary qualitative data, reinterpreting interviews that they've reinterpreted.
Yeah.
Do they check and challenge your interpretations, or do they stay well away from that level?
I mean, I suppose in the sort of general sphere of being academics, researchers working in the same sphere, they could sort of, if they're invited to be peer reviewers, they could challenge. But I think there is, I mean, it's one of the tensions, or potential tensions, but I guess there's a kind of understanding that if you archive, you're offering that there for somebody else to reinterpret. So I think it's a theoretical situation that could arise, but I think in the sort of friendly qual community, you wouldn't necessarily say someone got it wrong, because you could say that about any qualitative analysis, couldn't you? And in terms of the level of involvement, again, I think it's not black and white. So as I say, many of the researchers are still working in this area. I've been put in touch with a PhD student who's also drawing on the same data set, and we've had some really nice, you know, sort of collaborative chats about this. So I think it's just about being mindful of how much time people have got available to engage with you, whether they want to, whether they're still interested in it, and not becoming a pest, as I've been thinking about, so not asking them questions every 5 seconds. But yes, kind of common sense, I think. But yeah, there is interesting writing. If people want to read into some of the references that I've included to sort of think through in a bit more detail and a bit more articulately than I've just done about those tensions that could arise.
Absolutely, no, you've done so extremely articulately, but thank you for highlighting some of those, which are very, very interesting. So now I'd like to invite everybody, all of our speakers, back on camera, and we can have a little bit of a Q&A session. We do have some questions have come through. I've also got some of my own, so if you'd like your questions answered, get them down so I don't monopolise our speakers. I think this is a really good one to start off with. So we have a question for all of the speakers. Obviously, this is a social research association event, and most people here are social researchers. But is there a role, do you visualize members of the public accessing these archives and using them in any way, rather than simply social researchers, or perhaps people who work in slightly adjacent fields to research? Are there wider applications of this data? Who would like to start? Perhaps Angela, I think that might be a good place for you to start.
I mean, I come from a slightly different perspective. So because we are archiving in the public interest, which is our kind of GDPR basis for doing so, we are creating a collection that is designed has a legacy, so for reuse in the future to the public as a broader public. And I think coming from an archives background as well, kind of making archives more relevant to the public. And I guess the question of definition of who is a researcher and what makes you, you know, able to access it and its relevance to a broader public is ongoing. But yeah, I do have a different perspective on that because of my background, so it might not answer that question, sorry.
And are there any sort of particular public engagement events or things for your archive?
At the moment, well, we tend to reuse the archive in exhibitions and so on. So like other people will use it for their kind of, for their aims. So like the Science Museum have used it, we'll use it in kind of policy, or we'll use it in stuff like that, but people can access it within the British Library. But our bigger thing is we've got this funding bid in to do a bigger project called Socialising the Archive. And rather than it being us telling people what they should find, you know, someone mentioned just then about how you access and search data and how data becomes relevant, is actually our plan is to work with different groups, different user groups represented within the health service, to actually use the archive and create their own finding tools. So whatever those finding tools look like, that might be different to what they look like to an academic historian or an academic social scientist, to make it kind of relevant, because there's no point us picking data out and saying, oh, why don't you look at this? We think this is interesting. It's turning it on its head and asking, I suppose, communities of interest. What relevance is, particularly around healthcare and access to unequal healthcare and such things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. And what about anybody else who's perhaps more of got a research focused archive?
Well, I mean, the modern British historians that I talk to point out that history is becoming really quite a mass product, with horrible histories and all the podcasts on the media and whatever. And her view is that that people will start researching their local histories and, you know, the histories of the times of their parents and whatever. So we hope to collect more local social research as we go on, and that people will just generally be interested in the life and times of their parents or grandparents. So it's not exactly public, but people who are interested in history, I would say.
Absolutely, yeah. Any other comments from our other speakers on that one, or shall I move along?
I was just curious to know, from Angela, so is the archive anonymised, or is it done on completely different auspices that people are happy and willing to? So I know in your slides there's faces and voices of people, isn't there? So is it an audio archive as well?
It's there is a complete audio archive. So it uses a method called oral history, which traditionally people do assign the name to. So basically it's not it's the way the interviews are conducted, they can't be anonymised. However, we do have the option of using a pseudonym, so that the interview is archived using a fake name, in which case, if someone stumbled upon it, they would know that it was you. But if they were searching you, they couldn't find you. That's the kind of, but not many people really use a pseudonym. Most people are proud to kind of share even really intimate, dark, challenging aspects of their health and COVID history, and have that on the public record is fine. We do also offer closures as well, because we're kind of working with the British Library. There are some people who have maybe done quite critical COVID interviews that have actually closed access to their full interview for a period of, say, 50, 70 years.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, because of whether people can ever be fully aware of what might be done with that data. But it's interesting because it's so belt and braces. If you go through a UKRI, like a academic research funder, it's to the nth degree of anonymity, and nothing shall pass that could identify someone, whereas probably what's using a very similar interview methodology under a different auspices is absolutely, the aim is to make it as open as possible, and people are able to put their name and face to it if they want to. So I just find that really interesting. There's the different moral arguments, I guess.
It does come up quite a lot, this idea of, you know, personal, because it's personal data identifying. And actually, I would argue, kind of from our methodological perspective, that there is something about not silencing people as well. Obviously, like, there can be anonymity in other ways, and it can encourage people to take part, but equally people take part because they don't want to be anonymous as well. Sorry, hijacking.
No, that is very fascinating, isn't it? And it's all of these sort of ethical tensions and the different ways that data is collected. Like, I work in a commercial research agency, and the consent that we get to publish research and publish people's stories is a slightly different process as well, and perhaps less involved process. So there's things we can definitely all learn from each other. So there's another question, which is quite a broad question. So I'll ask sort of maybe each of you to think of one benefit. So what, in your opinion, are the contemporary benefits of using historical archives? What can we learn? You'll have all covered this in various different ways, but your sort of top benefit that you see from using historical archives. Who would like to jump in first?
Well, I'll go first, because the obvious one is it's basically that ability to understand and look back. And if you don't understand the past, you know, all the quotes, you're in danger of repeating it, and you can't look forward. And to me, it's just fascinating to see how people lived even 50 years ago. And it's given me a lot of perspective.
Absolutely, yeah, brilliant. How about Christina, do you have a view on what the benefits are?
Pardon me, is definitely around comparative research. What has been there, what is now, and how do we even get better from that? And that's what we usually see in our projects as well. And we can see a huge increase in people using longitudinal data as well, because they do want to track the individual and how the individual opinion, behavior change throughout time.
Yeah, so that sort of tracking of similar questions, and it was sort of, as Phyllis, you mentioned in your presentation, ask the same questions over time is very, very interesting. Angela, what do you think?
I guess there's a number of reasons why we should be using historical archives. Just thinking about the kind of context of this event, I think the reuse of data, which you were just talking about in your presentation, I'd never really thought of it that way, because coming from a kind of a heritage archive perspective, you want people to reuse the things that you've collected. You want it to be as widely accessible as possible. And obviously there are tensions around your intellectual property right, stuff like that. But actually, it's what's the point in doing it if it's not going to be used, is my question as well. Like, so even if you've done something 20 years ago and someone wants to reuse it now, actually that should be something you could be proud of, like the idea of legacy and learning and having fun as well, I guess.
Absolutely, definitely. And Annie, what about you, the main benefits for you?
Yeah, I think as a thinking of qualitative archives, I think it is that thing of, qualitative interviews generate so much content, and often on an initial project there just isn't time or resource to do it justice. So I think in some ways, whether it's the original team going back with additional grants or more time, or whether it's new researchers coming to use it, it's really sort of making the most of what people have given their time and their sort of emotional investment in to get that out. And I think, again, one of the arguments around, if it's a sensitive topic, do we want to keep reinventing the wheel when, keep asking people the same challenging questions, when we might be able to get a lot more sort of consolidate what's already known from studies that maybe didn't have the time or resource to really get the most out of their data sets. So I think there is an argument, but yeah, again, sort of very still open to sort of hearing arguments either way. And there's this issue about, is this an austerity thing, with the Research Council saying we must all reuse. So yes, keep it in balance. But yeah, absolutely, Angela's thing about it being a public good as well. And I think that does sit in tension with some of the anonymity and GDPR stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is really interesting. There's all these different archives have been sort of showcased in a way here, and it's really interesting to know that you're absolutely right, that what is the point of all of this data being there and all of these stories being out there if they're not used, and hopefully this event today has drawn some attention to some of these different sources, and hopefully people can find some interesting stories from them. A couple of you mentioned that this can also be used, I mean, this was the beginning of your project, Annie and Phyllis, you mentioned this as well, that it can be used to contextualize, to scope, to understand around an issue that might not be, you might be doing your own data collection yourself, but this can also help to contextualize. Why do you think that scoping and contextualizing is important, and what do you think are the barriers to what needs to be overcome for more researchers to do this as part of their projects rather than just jumping straight in?
Shall I go?
Yeah.
That's a big question, but to know all is very important. And if you, especially when you're very young, you tend to believe that you know everything about the subject. And it's very good to find out that actually you might be reinventing wheels, that people have thought of this before, and that there are different aspects. It's a little bit like when you first start work and you're sort of used to working on your own much more, and you start work and you start realizing that other people have very, very valid opinions and interests and can add a great amount to what you think about something. So it's just that broadness. I mean, just a silly example, the professor who was researching pets, she'd come up to the 1950s and she was using ARIS for the more recent stuff. And she hadn't realised, when we looked at the Dangerous Dogs Acts, which probably you're all too young to remember, there was a big discussion and row about dangerous dogs and the acts and whatever. She hadn't realised, A, what a role government sometimes played in it, but also within the questionnaires were attitudes of people who didn't own dangerous dogs to those who did own dangerous dogs, and what other people thought of should be done about these dangerous dogs. And so you've got this whole broader look at things. So it can prevent you reinventing the wheel, and it just gives you that broader, and it just makes you look better and more intelligent, I think, to know more about your subject.
And I suppose a lot of at least academic projects start with a literature review, but some of this stuff is not necessarily going to be in those databases that are traditionally used. So yeah. Anyone, any thoughts on sort of how to encourage more people to contextualize through archives, or why you think it's valuable?
I just was thinking, like, along the lines of what you were just talking there, one of the joys of kind of working on creating this collection is that whilst we work as academics in a university, our overall research aim was very loose, if that makes sense. So, and it wasn't research funded through the UKRI, through the first iteration. It was through the National Lottery, which focuses on engagement and so on. And actually having a broad, tell us about the NHS, opens up this, I mean, I can't even begin to describe the amount of differentials of stories from 18-year-olds to 105-year-olds across the breadth of the history of the NHS, including COVID. And, you know, that openness lends itself to a different kind of research. So now our research outputs are kind of often in response to things, or in response to questions, or things that have come of interest. But quite often when you set out to do research, you're so defined by what you apply into the Research Council to do, that it almost stifles your kind of ability to then maybe go off on a tangent or ask other questions. Or if you're creating this data, they might talk about something really interesting, but you're almost shutting them down because it's not about that kind of your big overarching question. So I do think that has been a joy for this particular project. And how, I suppose one of our questions from the project is, how do you make research a little bit more agile and curious, particularly when you've got these limitations, like you just talking about, the austerity of funding and, you know, cuts in salary, you know what I mean? It's quite difficult, isn't it?
Absolutely, no, it's very true. And particularly, you know, like you're saying, in academic research, again, commercial research, probably even more sort of straitjacketed in terms of you're being paid to do work for a client, in which case you must ask only those questions that the client wants to ask. So yeah, there is that lack of flexibility and freedom, absolutely. And I don't want to finish on a negative note, but I did want to ask what all of your thoughts were on, in terms of what are the main limitations of using archived research. You know, we've talked so much about the benefits, and there are absolutely so many. Are there any limitations that people want to be aware of if they're considering using archives in their work?
I think just that you can come up against cul-de-sacs because you're following something through and something isn't there that you would like. But it, you know, so it can be frustrating. But you know, I mean, talking about agility, you know, hopefully it makes you more creative to look elsewhere. And again, you'll be surprised what there is if only you keep an open mind and are creative in how you think about approaching a subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Any final comments on that, Annie? I think you came off mute.
It was only to say a very similar thing, just about, you know, it's pretty much these archives are static once they're archived. That's the nature of them, isn't it? So yeah, just to reiterate what I said in the slides about the time, almost a prelim project in the feasibility scoping of getting to know what's in the archive and can I answer my new research question. But going back to what Andrew said, you know, new research questions can arise from looking at the archive. Things that the researchers weren't necessarily asking about do crop up. And I think in Timescapes as a paper, somebody started a whole new project on grandfathering or grandparenting, realizing that when they were being interviewed about something else, the role of grandparenting kept coming up, and we're able to draw out new research questions about that. or in my proposal, looking at language use. So people weren't being asked directly about their mental health issues, but I want to look at what kind of vocabulary people use to talk about distress. So there's scope to see, you know, what kind of questions can I ask, or if I was going to take this into a new project, how should I phrase those questions to sort of chime with the way people use language.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Someone's asked me to look at the concept of wellness, and the word wellness doesn't appear once in our archive before the 1990s when it became into general use. But I've got plenty of studies that are about what we now call wellness. But you know, you really have to think about these sorts of things.
Yeah, especially the use of language, everything like that. It's totally fascinating. That is all we have time for today. That has really flown by. So thank you all so much for your contributions. Thank you to everyone who's attended today. This has been being recorded, so the recordings will be up on the SRA website, as will the slides, so that people can follow those links that everyone's so kindly put in there. And of course, just a massive thank you to our speakers, and I'm sure they'll all be they've all put their contact details, so if you are willing to donate or you're interested in learning more, I'm sure they would welcome any contact from you all. So thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.